The quantum lift doors slid open with a faint hiss, revealing a world that seemed to exist only in the wildest imaginations of humanity. Recruit Thorn stepped out, his boots echoing faintly against the gleaming floors of the Galactic Defense Force Academy's main hall. His heart pounded as he took in the alien architecture, its towering spires and bioluminescent panels casting shifting colors across the vast space. This was the first day of his new life, a dream he had fought for, sacrificed for, and now, standing here, it all felt surreal. But dreams don't come without challenges, and Thorn was about to face one far greater than he had imagined. The air felt heavy, not from gravity but from the stairs. Hundreds of alien recruits filled the hall, their forms as diverse as the stars themselves. There were towering crystalline beings whose refracted light painted the walls in shimmering rainbows, and ethereal entities that seemed to float just inches above the ground. Then there was Thorn, the lone human in a sea of species far more advanced, evolved, and experienced in the art of survival. He could feel their eyes on him, sharp and dissecting, as if he were some strange anomaly that didn't belong. "Would you look at that?" A voice chirped from above, cutting through the murmur of conversation. Thorn glanced up to see a small, winged alien perched on a high beam, its iridescent wings catching the light. "They're letting primates into the academy now? What's next, pets?" A ripple of laughter echoed around the hall, and Thorn felt his cheeks flush. He squared his shoulders, gripping the strap of his regulation duffel bag tighter. This was exactly what he had prepared for: the doubt, the ridicule, the outright mockery. Humanity was the newest member of the galactic community, and their reputation was less than stellar. Primitive, fragile, barely capable of interstellar travel, that's what most of the galaxy thought. But Thorn wasn't here to prove them right. He was here to prove them wrong. "Careful, Zix 427, rumbled a voice from a crystalline giant who stood nearby. Its name tag read VX, and its deep, resonant tone carried both amusement and menace. "Ahina humans are fragile, wouldn't want to break the Academy's newest experiment." The laughter grew louder, and Thorn could feel the heat of humiliation creeping up his neck. He knew he shouldn't respond, knew that reacting would only feed their taunts. But as he walked through the parting crowd, their jabs became harder to ignore. "Hey, human!" Another voice called out, and Thorn turned just in time to see a glob of sticky biotoxin hurtling toward him. His reflexes kicked in, and he sidestepped the projectile, letting it splatter harmlessly against the floor. A murmur ran through the crowd, whether impressed or annoyed, Thorn couldn't tell. "Nice try," he said, flashing a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "But humans are pretty good at dodging." The laughter subsided, but the stares lingered. Thorn pushed forward, his heart racing. He didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing him falter. He had earned his place here, just like the rest of them. The Academy's acceptance rate was notoriously low, and he'd fought tooth and nail for this chance. Still, the weight of their scorn hung heavy on him as he entered the next hall. A booming voice cut through the tension, and Thorn looked up to see a massive hologram materialize in the center of the room. The image of Commandant Axor, a legendary figure among the galactic forces, filled the space. Axor's nebulous form glowed with an otherworldly light, and its voice carried an authority that silenced even the most boisterous recruits. "Welcome, cadets," Axor intoned. "You represent the finest your species have to offer. Together, you will train to become the next generation of the Galactic Defense Force." The Commandant's gaze, or the holographic approximation of it, swept across the crowd, pausing momentarily on Thorn. It was subtle, but Thorn felt it like a spotlight, illuminating his every insecurity. Axor continued, highlighting the strengths of each species. Warrior races received nods of approval. Intellectual species stood a little taller. And then there was Thorn, standing alone, feeling the weight of being an outsider. As the hologram faded and the recruits began to disperse, Thorn found himself replaying the Commandant's words. He wanted to believe he belonged here, but the disdain in the eyes of his peers made it hard. The whispers followed him as he made his way to the residential wing, his new home for the foreseeable future. Inside his pod, Thorn tossed his bag onto the adaptive bed, which struggled momentarily to reshape itself for human physiology. He sighed, sitting on the edge and staring out the quantum glass window. The view of Centaurus Prime's 3 moons was breathtaking, but it did little to soothe his unease. He knew the days ahead would be grueling. The Academy's training was designed to push even the most advanced species to their limits. For Thorn, those limits were already being tested. "Begin cadet profile scan," Thorn said aloud, activating the room's A. Processing, the air responded, its tone neutral. After a pause, it added, "Species, human. Enhanced capabilities, none detected. Biological limitations, multiple. Threat assessment, minimal." Thorn let out a bitter laugh, lying back on the bed. Minimal threat, that's what they all thought. But if there was one thing humanity excelled at, it was defying expectations. He'd survived zero-gravity combat training, planetary exploration, and grueling endurance tests back on Earth. This was just another challenge. A bigger one, sure, but not impossible. As he closed his eyes, he resolved to prove them wrong. Every taunt, every dismissive glance, they would fuel him. Because humans had a strength no one else seemed to understand. They didn't give up, no matter the odds. And Thorn was about to show the entire galaxy what that meant. But before he could fully drift off, the emergency alarms bled to life, shattering the quiet. The pod's lights shifted to a harsh red, and the AI's voice crackled with urgency. "Warning: catastrophic quantum core destabilization detected. All cadets proceed to evacuation points immediately." This is not a drill. Thorn shot up, heart pounding as the gravity of the situation set in. The Academy was in danger, and from the sound of it, the danger was imminent. As the alarms continued to wail, Thorn grabbed his jacket and sprinted toward the corridor, his mind racing with questions. What was happening? Who was responsible? And most importantly, could he do anything to stop it? The answer, he realized, might determine not just his fate, but the future of everyone at the Academy. Thorn raced down the corridor, the shrill wail of alarms echoing around him as the lights strobed an ominous red. The sleek metallic walls, designed to inspire awe and efficiency, now felt suffocating as cadets of every imaginable shape and size surged toward evacuation points. He dodged a cluster of insectoid beings, their rapid clicking echoing his own panic. He could barely hear himself think over the cacophony of alarms and the thundering footfalls of panicked recruits. He wasn't the only one who looked out of place. Despite their advanced biology and cutting-edge technology, many of the alien cadets seemed just as disoriented as he was. If this was some kind of training exercise, the Academy was doing a remarkable job of selling it. But Thorn had a gut feeling this wasn't a drill. The panic in the AI's voice and the urgency in the alarms told him otherwise. As Thorn rounded a corner, he caught sight of a massive holoscreen mounted on the wall. A live feed from the core reactor room played in real time, showing flashing hazard warnings and the reactor itself glowing a dangerous, unstable orange. Energy readings scrolled across the screen in an alien script, but Thorn didn't need to read them to know something. Before he could stop himself, he bumped into a tall, armored figure who barely flinched from the impact. Thorn stumbled back, muttering an apology, only to look up and meet the piercing eyes of a Strengthn officer. The Strengthn, a reptilian species known for their unmatched tactical minds, glared at him with a mix of disdain and curiosity. "Watch where you're going, human," the officer growled, his voice low and guttural. But instead of walking away, he paused, sizing Thorn up. "Why are you heading toward the evacuation point? Shouldn't you be proving your worth right now?" Thorn blinked, taken aback. "What are you talking about? The alarms are a test of resolve," the Strengthn interrupted sharply. "Or perhaps not. Either way, running won't win you respect. If you want to survive in this Academy, human, you'll need to do more than flee at the first sign of danger." The words stung, but Thorn forced himself to meet the officer's gaze. "And what would you suggest I do?" "Walk into the reactor room and fix the core with my bare hands." The Strengthn's mouth curled into what might have been a smirk. "No, but standing out requires more than running with the herd. You might surprise yourself if you look for ways to act rather than react." Before Thorn could respond, the Strengthn turned and disappeared into the chaos. Thorn stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. Was this really some elaborate test, or was the Academy genuinely in danger? Either way, doing nothing wasn't an option. He had come here to prove himself, not just to his peers, but to the entire galaxy. and maybe, just maybe, this was his chance. Pushing his doubts aside, Thorn made his way toward a side corridor away from the main flow of cadets. The hallway was quieter here, the chaos fading into the background. His boots echoed on the polished floor as he moved cautiously forward, scanning for any sign of where he might be needed. He didn't have to look far. Up ahead, a group of cadets had gathered near a locked bulkhead. They appeared to be arguing, their voices a mix of languages and tones that Thorn couldn't fully understand. One of them, a tall, insectoid creature with shimmering green exoskeleton, noticed him and clicked its mandibles in what seemed like frustration. "You human," it called out, its voice buzzing with impatience. "Are you just going to stand there, or will you make yourself useful?" Thorn approached cautiously. "What's going on?" "The reactor's containment protocols are failing," another cadet explained, this one a stocky creature with thick, leathery skin and glowing blue eyes. "This bulkhead leads to the engineering wing, but the override controls are jammed. We need to get through to stabilize the core." Thorn glanced at the bulkhead, its control panel sparking faintly. He wasn't an engineer, but he had enough experience from Earth's survival training to recognize a malfunctioning system. Without thinking, he stepped forward, dropping his bag and inspecting the controls. "What are you doing?" the insectoid cadet demanded, its mandibles clicking nervously. "You're not qualified." "Do you have a better idea?" Thorn shot back, his fingers already moving across the interface. The panel was unfamiliar, its symbols alien, but the underlying mechanics weren't too different from what he had seen before. He bypassed the damaged circuit, rerouting power to the manual release. With a loud hiss, the bulkhead began to slide open, revealing a dimly lit corridor beyond. The group stared at Thorn in stunned silence before the leathery-skinned cadet gave him a nod of approval. "Not bad for a human," it said gruffly. "But this is just the start. If you're coming with us, keep up." Thorn hesitated for only a moment before grabbing his bag and following the group into the engineering wing. The air grew hotter and more oppressive as they approached the reactor room, the walls vibrating faintly from the unstable energy within. Emergency lights cast long, flickering shadows, and the hum of machinery filled the space with a constant, unsettling rhythm. Inside the reactor room, the scene was worse than Thorn had expected. The core pulsed erratically, its containment field flickering like a dying star. A team of Academy engineers was already at work, their voices overlapping in urgent tones as they scrambled to stabilize the system. The cadets hesitated, unsure of where to begin, but Thorn felt a surge of determination. He had come this far, he wasn't going to back down now. "What can we do to help?" Thorn asked, stepping forward. One of the engineers, a wiry alien with translucent skin, looked up in surprise. "You're cadets, you're supposed to be evacuating." "We're here now," Thorn said firmly. "Tell us what you need." The engineer hesitated, then pointed toward a console on the far side of the room. "The auxiliary stabilizers need to be manually calibrated. If we can sync them with the main core, we might buy ourselves some time." Thorn nodded and motioned for the others to follow. Together, they navigated the chaotic room, dodging sparking cables and unstable equipment. At the console, the insectoid cadet took the lead, its dexterous limbs moving with surprising precision. Thorn worked alongside it, his hands steady despite the rising tension. The room grew hotter, the core's pulsing light casting eerie shadows across their faces. Every second felt like an eternity, but finally, the stabilizers began to hum in unison with the core. The flickering containment field steadied, its glow returning to a stable blue. For a moment, there was silence, an almost deafening contrast to the chaos that had preceded it. The engineers exchanged relieved glances, and Thorn felt a weight lift from his chest. They had done it. Against all odds, they had bought the Academy precious time. But as Thorn looked back at the reactor, a new unease settled over him. This wasn't the end of the crisis, it was only the beginning. Thorn wiped the sweat from his brow, his chest rising and falling with deep, labored breaths. The crisis in the reactor room seemed momentarily under control, but the eerie silence that followed left him uneasy. The core's glow had stabilized, but something about the situation didn't feel right. The Academy was too advanced, too prepared, to have such a critical failure. Accidents like this didn't just happen. The insectoid cadet, who Thorn had started to think of as the de facto leader of their makeshift group, turned toward him. Its mandibles twitched nervously. This was too close, it said, its buzzing voice low. And yet, the alarms still blare. Why? Thorn didn't have an answer. None of them did. The leathery-skinned cadet stepped closer to the console they had just repaired, its glowing eyes narrowing as it scanned the data feed. "This isn't over," it muttered, its deep voice tinged with a mix of frustration and fear. "Look here, secondary systems across the station are still failing. If we don't address them, the core will destabilize again." Thorn felt his stomach tighten. He was no stranger to pressure. Earth's harsh training regimens had taught him resilience, but this was beyond anything he'd experienced. He glanced back at the engineers, hoping for guidance, but they seemed just as uncertain as the cadets. Before anyone could formulate a plan, a sudden tremor shook the room. Thorn stumbled, barely managing to keep his footing as the vibrations rippled through the floor. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, sending chills down his spine. The core flared briefly, its glow intensifying before dimming again. The translucent-skinned engineer shouted above the noise. That wasn't an internal fault. Something hit the station. Hit the station. Thorn's mind raced. The Academy was supposed to be the most secure facility in the quadrant, protected by cutting-edge shields and a fleet of patrol ships. For it to be struck suggested either an unprecedented natural disaster or an attack. The leathery cadet growled under its breath. "This isn't a drill. We're under siege." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Thorn looked around at the other cadets, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. Whatever had just happened, they couldn't afford to wait for orders. "We need to figure out what's going on," Thorn said, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "If this is an attack, we need to be ready to fight, or at least survive." The insectoid cadet nodded. "Agreed. The Academy's defense systems should have intercepted anything before it got this far. Something is wrong, and we need answers." The group made their way out of the reactor room, the dim emergency lights casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. The corridors were eerily empty now, the earlier chaos replaced by an unsettling stillness. Thorn's footsteps echoed alongside the others as they moved cautiously through the maze-like halls. At one point, they passed a viewport overlooking the Academy's outer perimeter. Thorn stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. Beyond the reinforced glass, a massive alien vessel loomed, its jagged, angular design unlike anything he'd ever seen. The ship was a deep, obsidian black, its surface shimmering with strange, iridescent patterns. "What in the galaxy is that?" the leathery cadet whispered, its usually gruff voice tinged with awe. Thorn shook his head. He didn't recognize the ship's design, but one thing was clear. It wasn't here on a peaceful visit. Before they could move on, the insectoid cadet's antennae twitched, its body tensing. "We're not alone," it hissed. The group turned as one, their eyes scanning the dimly lit corridor. Thorn's heart raced as he strained to listen, his human senses nowhere near as sharp as the insectoid's. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a faint clicking sound echoed from around the corner. Thorn's instincts screamed at him to run, but he forced himself to stay rooted in place. Slowly, he crouched and motioned for the others to follow suit. Together, they pressed themselves against the wall, waiting in tense silence as the clicking grew louder. A shadow appeared first, long and spindly, cast by the flickering emergency lights. Then the creature stepped into view. It was tall and skeletal, its body covered in dark, chitinous armor that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its eyes glowed faintly, a piercing yellow that scanned the corridor with an unsettling intelligence. Thorn held his breath, his muscles taut as he fought the urge to move. The creature seemed to pause, tilting its head as if listening for something. For a moment, Thorn thought it might have sensed them. But then it turned and continued down the corridor, its clicking footsteps fading into the distance. Once the sound had completely disappeared, the group exhaled as one. The insectoid cadet's mandibles twitched nervously. "That wasn't one of ours," it said, stating the obvious. "No kidding," Thorn muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm guessing it's not friendly either." The leathery-skinned cadet growled. "We can't just sit here. If there are more of those things on board, we need to warn the others." Thorn nodded, his mind already racing through their options. The Academy's communication systems would likely be compromised, but if they could reach one of the secure command centers, they might be able to send a distress signal. "We'll head to the command deck," he said. "If nothing else, we can figure out what's going on from there." The group moved cautiously through the corridors, their earlier confidence replaced by a grim determination. Every shadow seemed to hold potential danger, every sound a possible threat. Thorn's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay focused. As they neared the command deck, the faint hum of machinery grew louder, accompanied by the occasional burst of static from malfunctioning panels. The group paused outside the main doors, which were sealed shut. "Of course," Thorn muttered, stepping forward to inspect the control panel. The insectoid cat had watched him closely. "Can you get it open?" "Maybe," Thorn said, his fingers already working to bypass the lock. The system was more advanced than the bulkhead they'd encountered earlier, but the basic principles were the same. He rerouted power to the manual override, his hands steady despite the tension. After a few nerve-wracking moments, the door hissed open, revealing the command deck beyond. Thorn stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. It was empty, the usual crew conspicuously absent. But before he could take another step, a voice crackled through the speakers, low and distorted. "You shouldn't have come here." Thorn froze, his blood turning to ice. Whoever, or whatever, was speaking, they weren't part of the Academy. And judging by the tone of their voice, they weren't here to negotiate.